In 1865, the chains fell, but the war for freedom had just begun. The cannons of the American Civil War went silent. Smoke cleared, the Union stood victorious. On paper, 4 million enslaved people were now legally free. Emancipation had a signature, freedom had a date. History books call this the end, but for the newly freed, this was not an ending. It was an exposure. They stepped out of bondage with no land, no money, no political power, and no protection from the very people who once owned them. Freedom existed in law but not in daily life. Former Confederate elites still controlled land, courts, and guns. The same plantations remained. The same power structures endured. Only the language had changed. Families searched for relatives sold away years earlier. Children worked the same fields, now labeled sharecroppers, bound by debt instead of chains. Black codes criminalized freedom itself, arresting people for unemployment, movement, or disrespect. Prison labor quietly replaced slavery. Violence enforced the old order when laws failed. This was not chaos, it was designed. Reconstruction promised equality, citizenship, and protection. For a brief moment, Black Americans voted, held office, built schools, and reshaped democracy itself. That moment terrified those who had ruled without challenge. So a second war began, not with cannons, but with policy, terror, and silence. Federal troops withdrew, courts looked away. White supremacy reorganized itself behind new names and legal language. The promise of freedom was slowly suffocated without officially reversing emancipation. This is the part history rushes past. Because if freedom can be granted and then quietly dismantled, the real battle was never about chains alone. It was about power, who holds it, who protects it, and who history chooses to remember. This is not the victory story you were taught. This is the hidden Second War. Before we enter the most uncomfortable chapter of American history, go ahead and hit like. Not because this is entertaining, but because YouTube needs proof that history still matters. And subscribe, because if you learned this part in school, your textbook was definitely missing pages. All right, humor aside, this matters. Most people are taught that after 1865, the United States moved forward, slavery ended, the nation healed, freedom expanded. It sounds clean. It sounds complete. It fits neatly into a paragraph before the class moves on. But history doesn't move in straight lines. What followed emancipation was not peace, it was a power struggle. A country trying to redefine who counted as human, who deserved rights, and who controlled the future. Laws changed faster than minds. Freedom was announced before it was protected. And when protection is absent, power fills the gap. This era wasn't a footnote. It reshaped American economics, politics, policing, and race relations for generations. The systems built during this time didn't disappear, they evolved. They were renamed, repackaged, and normalized. That's why this chapter is uncomfortable, because it forces a hard question. How can freedom exist legally while being denied practically? How can progress be declared while inequality deepens? And how can a nation celebrate victory while quietly undoing its promises? This isn't about guilt. It's about clarity. History isn't dangerous because it's ugly. It's dangerous when it's incomplete. When stories are simplified, patterns repeat. When causes are ignored, effects seem accidental. So take a breath. The tone is about to shift. What comes next isn't speculation or opinion. It's documented, deliberate, and foundational to understanding modern America. This is where the real story begins. Freedom did not mean equality. In 1865, slavery ended, but power did not change hands. The people who had enforced bondage still controlled the systems that governed daily life. Former enslavers retained ownership of the land. They dominated local courts. They influenced policing. They possessed weapons. The law had shifted, but authority had not. So freedom arrived without leverage. Newly freed men and women were expected to survive in a society designed to exclude them. They could not access land in a land-based economy. They faced courts run by the same elites who once profited from their captivity. Local law enforcement enforced order, not justice. Violence didn't need to be constant, it only needed to be possible. This was not accidental neglect. It was a structural imbalance. To address the crisis, the federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau, officially tasked with providing food, education, labor contracts, and legal support to formerly enslaved people and poor whites. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was fragile. The Bureau was severely underfunded. It lacked manpower. Its agents were often isolated, threatened, or ignored by local authorities. Southern politicians attacked it relentlessly, calling assistance to freed people government overreach. Courts overturned its decisions. Land redistribution once promised was reversed. Protection became temporary. Aid became conditional. The Bureau did not fail because its mission was wrong. It failed because it stood alone. Imagine being declared free while standing on land you do not own, judged by courts that do not see you as equal, and policed by forces that do not protect you. Freedom, without power, becomes a test of endurance rather than a guarantee of dignity. This is the uncomfortable truth of Reconstruction's beginning. Emancipation broke chains, but it did not break control. And when freedom threatens existing hierarchies, those hierarchies adapt. They learn a new language. They wear new uniforms, but they pursue the same goal. They were free but standing on land that hated their freedom. And that is why this victory was false. When chains were outlawed, ink took their place. After the Civil War, Southern states introduced a new legal architecture known as the Black Codes. On the surface, these were ordinary laws written, debated, and signed. In reality, they were precision tools designed to control black labor and restrict black life without openly restoring slavery. Freedom was declared. Then it was regulated. Under these laws, being unemployed could make you a criminal. Traveling without proof of work invited arrest. Speaking back to authority could be labeled disorderly conduct. Contracts were enforced only in one direction. The message was clear. Freedom was allowed but only under supervision. This was not chaos, it was a policy. The Black Codes forced formerly enslaved people back into labor through punishment. Once arrested, individuals were fined. When they couldn't pay, they were leased out to private employers to work off their debt. Prisons became labor pipelines. The plantation did not disappear, it was rebranded. This system required no chains. The law did the work. Courts enforced these statutes. Sheriffs executed them. Employers benefited from them. And the federal government, stretched thin and politically divided, often failed to stop them. What slavery could no longer claim openly, criminal law achieved quietly. This is where freedom became conditional. If movement requires permission, is it freedom? If work is compelled by threat of arrest, is it a choice? If the law itself can place you back into forced labor, what has truly changed? This betrayal did not arrive with violence alone, it arrived with paperwork, with signatures, with legal language that sounded neutral but functioned with deadly precision. History often tells us slavery ended in 1865. The truth is more unsettling. It evolved. And when the law turns against the free, oppression no longer needs chains, only compliance, courts, and silence. That is the danger of injustice written into law. When the law could no longer fully control the free, violence stepped in to finish the job. In the late 1860s, a shadow organization emerged across the South, the Ku Klux Klan. It presented itself as secretive, local, and unofficial, but its impact was anything but small. This was not chaos. This was coordination. Night riders moved under darkness, faces hidden, names protected. They targeted black voters, teachers, ministers, and community leaders, anyone who represented independence or progress. Churches were burned because they gathered people. Schools were destroyed because education created power. Homes were attacked not to steal but to warn. The message was deliberate. Freedom had limits. Lynchings were not random outbursts of anger. They were public spectacles meant to terrorize entire communities into silence. Violence replaced the plantation whip, achieving the same result through fear. You didn't need to be beaten to obey, you only needed to witness what happened to someone else. This terror served a political purpose. Reconstruction governments depended on black participation votes, office holders, organized communities. Terror dismantled that participation. It suppressed elections. It drove leaders into hiding. It made exercising rights feel like a death sentence. And when fear governs behavior, control becomes self-enforcing. Local authorities often looked away. Some quietly supported the violence, others claimed helplessness. Federal intervention came late, uneven, and temporary. When protection disappears, terror fills the vacuum. This is how chains were replaced without ever being restored. The whip was gone. Fear took its place, and fear doesn't need ownership papers. It doesn't need laws written in ink. It only needs to be believed. History often frames this period as lawlessness. That framing is convenient but false. What happened was organized political terror, aimed at reversing emancipation without officially undoing it. Freedom survived on paper, but in the streets, at night, and in the shadows it was hunted. And that is how terror became policy. For a brief moment after the Civil War, America attempted something radical. This period known as Reconstruction was not just about rebuilding the South. It was about redefining democracy itself. For the first time in U.S. history, black men voted in large numbers, served on juries, and were elected to local, state, and federal office. New state constitutions expanded public education. Thousands of schools were founded. Citizenship was written into law, not as a favor, but as a right. It was almost a revolution. Formerly enslaved people did not wait to be invited into freedom, they built it. They organized churches, mutual aid societies, newspapers, and political coalitions. The idea was simple and dangerous: a multiracial democracy governed by law, not hierarchy. That idea triggered a backlash. White resistance intensified as black political power grew. Violence undermined elections. Economic pressure punished independence. And slowly, the legal system began to retreat. The United States Supreme Court narrowed the meaning of the Reconstruction Amendments, ruling that federal protection had limits. Rights existed, but enforcement weakened. Meanwhile, the North grew tired. Reconstruction required troops, money, and political will. As years passed, commitment faded. National attention shifted to economic crises and westward expansion. Protecting black citizens became negotiable. Stability became more important than justice. Then came the turning point. In 1877, a disputed presidential election was resolved through a private political deal. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction governments collapsed almost overnight. The promise of protection ended not with a vote of the people, but with an agreement among elites. Freedom was negotiated away behind closed doors. What followed was not immediate slavery but abandonment. Without federal enforcement, the gains of Reconstruction unraveled. Rights remained written, but undefended. Hope gave way to vulnerability. Reconstruction proved what was possible. Its collapse proved how fragile progress can be. It was almost a revolution. Almost. Freedom didn't collapse overnight. It was left alone. After Reconstruction ended, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, the last visible line between fragile freedom and returning control. With their departure, Southern state governments quickly reasserted authority, not through open rebellion, but through law, custom, and routine. The promise of protection quietly disappeared. What followed was not confusion. It was consolidation. Southern legislatures moved with speed and precision. New systems of segregation separated daily life where people could live, learn, work, and move. Voting rights were buried under literacy tests, poll taxes, and bureaucratic traps designed to exclude without explicitly naming race. The ballot box closed, political power narrowed. Citizenship became theoretical. This era became known as Jim Crow, not a single law, but a web of practices enforced over generations. Its impact was cumulative. When voting is denied, policy reflects only those in power. When education is unequal, opportunity compounds in one direction. When neighborhoods are restricted, wealth cannot accumulate. Poverty becomes inherited not because of failure, but because of design. The North watched this happen. National attention shifted elsewhere: industry, expansion, global ambition. The suffering of black citizens in the South became distant, inconvenient, and politically costly to address. Intervention required effort, silence required none, so silence won. Freedom still existed on paper, amendments were still written, rights were still named. But without enforcement, rights became suggestions, and suggestions can be ignored. This was not a dramatic reversal. It was abandonment. No declaration announced it. No vote recorded it. It simply happened, one withdrawn troop, one ignored election, one unchallenged law at a time. And yet, freedom did not die. It survived in families, churches, songs, memory, and resistance. It endured quietly, waiting for protection to return. Freedom didn't die. It was abandoned, and abandonment, in history, can be just as devastating as defeat. History does not stay in the past. It casts shadows. The choices made after emancipation were protected. Who was ignored, who held power did not disappear with time. They hardened into systems, and those systems still shape the present. Wealth gaps did not appear by accident. When land ownership was denied, when wages were suppressed, when neighborhoods were restricted, wealth could not compound. Opportunity moved in one direction for generations. The result today is not mystery, it is momentum. Voter suppression did not end with literacy tests. It evolved. Complex rules, restricted access, and strategic barriers still decide whose voice is heard and whose is filtered out. Democracy survives, but unevenly. Policing and incarceration carry the same historical echo. When freedom was once criminalized, enforcement became a substitute for control. Over time, punishment replaced protection. Entire communities learned that the law could be present without being just. These are not disconnected problems. They are chapters of the same story, one that never fully closed. And this is where the narrative matters. Because when history is framed as ancient or irrelevant, responsibility fades. Patterns repeat quietly. But when history is understood as unfinished, accountability returns. The past stops being a museum and becomes a mirror. This isn't about blame. It's about cause and effect. If a nation builds freedom without protection, inequality is not a failure, it's a forecast. If rights exist without enforcement, injustice doesn't need hatred to survive. It only needs time. This is why remembering matters. Not to reopen wounds, but to understand why they never healed. This isn't just Black history. This is unfinished American history. And until the promises made are fully protected, the shadow remains not behind us, but beneath our feet, shaping where we stand and where we are allowed to go. History is not asking to be admired. It is asking to be finished. At the end of every war, history looks for a finish line. But some endings don't arrive with victory. They arrive with silence. By 1865, slavery was abolished. By law, freedom existed. Yet what followed revealed a harder truth. Freedom can be weakened without chains, erased without repeal, and delayed without announcement. It doesn't always disappear, it thins, it fades. It becomes conditional, and that is the most dangerous form of loss. Because when freedom is taken quietly, people are taught to blame themselves. When opportunity narrows slowly, inequality feels natural. When rights exist only on paper, injustice hides behind legality. Nothing appears broken, yet nothing truly works. History shows us this pattern clearly. Freedom without protection becomes survival. Freedom without power becomes permission. Freedom without enforcement becomes memory. This story was never only about the past. It was a warning written early. Every generation inherits the question left unresolved by the one before it. Not whether freedom exists, but whether it is defended. Because freedom is not self-sustaining. It requires structure. It requires vigilance. It requires people willing to protect it when it becomes inconvenient, expensive, or unpopular. That is the lesson Reconstruction left unfinished. Not that progress is impossible, but that it is fragile. Not that freedom fails, but that it must be guarded. And not that history is over, but that it waits to see who will finish it. So sit with this not as a slogan, not as an argument, but as a question history has already tested once. Silence. If freedom can be taken without chains, hold 3 seconds. What does real freedom actually require? Fade out.